The psychology of people who were called antisocial for not watching sports. Marcus had always been the outsider at every workplace gathering, every family reunion, every Monday morning conversation. While his colleagues bonded over weekend games and fantasy leagues, he sat silent, watching a ritual he wouldn't join. They thought he was strange, antisocial, maybe even broken. But what if he wasn't the one missing something? What if they were the ones trapped in an ancient pattern they couldn't see? Because inside Marcus's mind, a different world was unfolding. While millions screamed at screens watching strangers chase balls across grass, he was building something they'd never understand. A choice so radical it made him invisible in rooms full of people. This is the story of those who broke free from humanity's oldest addiction, and what they discovered on the other side. The conference room fell into that familiar rhythm every Monday morning. Tom from accounting was already animated, reliving Saturday's game play by play. Sarah jumped in with statistics Marcus didn't care to remember. Even Mr. Henderson, the stern CFO, had softened his usually rigid demeanor, laughing about a referee's bad call. Marcus stirred his coffee and stared at the table. "You catch the game, Marcus?" Tom asked, his voice carrying that mixture of genuine interest and automatic assumption that everyone shared his passion. "No, I didn't," Marcus replied simply. The room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a slight cooling in the air. Tom exchanged a glance with Sarah, the kind of glance that said, "There he goes again." "Man, you missed an incredible finish," Tom continued, trying to bridge the gap. "Down by 3 with 30 seconds left, and Jackson—" "I'm sure it was exciting," Marcus interrupted gently. He'd learned not to let these conversations stretch too long. They never ended well. What Tom couldn't know, what none of them could understand, was that Marcus hadn't simply missed the game. He had actively chosen to spend those 3 hours differently. While 47 million people watched the same event unfold, Marcus had been in his garage workshop, lost in the intricate process of building a custom guitar. His hands had shaped wood, his mind had solved problems, he had created something that didn't exist before. Marcus wasn't antisocial, he wasn't traumatized by childhood sports, he didn't lack the capacity for passion or excitement. The psychological assessments were clear, he was perfectly normal. But something in his brain worked differently when it came to this specific human behavior. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neuroscientist who spent 15 years studying sports fandom, discovered something startling in her research. Approximately 12% of the population possesses what she calls elevated thresholds for arbitrary tribalism. Their brains simply require more substantial reasons to activate the ancient loyalty circuits that sports exploited so effectively in others. Marcus was one of them. His colleagues weren't wrong to notice his difference. What they were wrong about was what that difference meant. Because while they bonded over shared emotional experiences tied to events outside their control, Marcus had developed an entirely different relationship with his cognitive resources. It's not that these individuals lack tribal instincts, it's that their tribal mechanisms require genuine personal investment, not symbolic representation. Their mirror neurons are working perfectly, they've simply redirected them.
3 months after that Monday meeting, Marcus was passed over for the senior designer position. The official reason was cultural fit concerns. The unofficial reason was whispered in hallways. He doesn't really connect with the team. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He had worked late more nights than anyone. He had helped colleagues with projects outside his own responsibilities. He remembered birthdays, asked about sick family members, and volunteered for the company charity drives. But he didn't participate in the office fantasy football league. He didn't attend the Super Bowl watch parties. And in this culture, that absence spoke louder than his presence in every other way. His wife, Jennifer, understood, but even she felt the social cost. At neighborhood barbecues, while other couples bonded over team rivalries and playoff predictions, she found herself making excuses for Marcus's absence from conversations. "He's just not really into sports," she'd say. watching the slight judgment flash across faces before people moved on to talk with someone else. Marcus's younger brother, David, was getting married. At the rehearsal dinner, their father stood to give a toast. Richard Coleman was a man who'd built his entire social identity around being a Dallas Cowboys fan. His den was a shrine. His friendships revolved around game days. His relationship with both his sons had been mediated through this lens. "I remember when the boys were young," Richard began, his voice thick with nostalgia. "David would sit with me every Sunday, learning the game, sharing those moments every father dreams of having with his sons." He paused, and the room sensed what was coming. Marcus preferred to be alone with his books and his projects. I tried to bring him into the fold, but some people just marched to their own drum. The words were delivered with a smile, but the pain underneath was unmistakable. My son rejected what I valued most. Marcus felt the familiar sting, the same sting he'd felt at 12 when his father's disappointment was palpable after he'd declined to play Little League. The same sting at 16 when he'd skipped the homecoming game to work on a robotics project. The same sting that had followed him into adulthood, marking him as somehow deficient in the most tribal of human experiences. But something different happened this time. As Marcus looked around the room, at the nodding heads, the sympathetic glances toward his father, the assumption that he was the one missing out, he realized something profound. These people weren't celebrating his father's connection to sports. They were mourning Marcus's perceived inability to connect at all. They had it completely backwards. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He began to write. Not about sports, about everything else. About the hundreds of hours he'd spent mastering classical guitar. About the nonprofit he'd quietly started to teach coding to underprivileged kids. About the novel he'd been writing for 3 years, creating entire worlds and characters with depths and conflicts that he controlled and shaped. He wrote about his friendship with Kenji, the Japanese woodworker who'd taught him traditional joinery techniques through patient afternoons in a dusty workshop. He wrote about his sister-in-law, Amber, with whom he'd spent countless hours discussing philosophy, quantum physics, and the nature of consciousness. He wrote about the online community of custom guitar builders who knew his username and respected his craftsmanship. By dawn, Marcus had filled 17 pages, and looking at those pages, he saw something clearly for the first time. His life was overflowing with passion, community, and meaningful connection. He wasn't missing the tribal experience. He was living a different version of it. Dr. Rodriguez's research had found exactly this pattern. In brain scans of non-sports fans, the regions associated with empathy, emotional engagement, and social bonding weren't dormant. They were actively firing, but they were responding to different stimuli. When a dedicated sports fan scores their team, specific neural pathways light up associated with personal achievement. Remarkably, when individuals like Marcus complete a challenging project or help a student finally grasp a difficult concept, the exact same neural pathways activate. The neural reward is identical. They're experiencing the same biochemical satisfaction. They've simply found it through creation rather than observation. The study went deeper. Non-sports fans showed equal or higher activation in regions associated with delayed gratification and intrinsic motivation. Where sports fans received regular dopamine hits from game outcomes outside their control, people like Marcus had trained their brains to derive satisfaction from personal achievement and authentic creation. They haven't rejected tribalism, they've evolved it.
But the world wasn't ready to hear this. Marcus's moment of clarity didn't change the social landscape he navigated daily. If anything, understanding his difference made the isolation more acute.
because now he knew he wasn't broken, but he also knew that explaining this to people would sound defensive, pretentious, even hostile. He was stuck between two worlds, the one that demanded his participation in collective spectating, and the one he'd built where individual creation mattered more. 6 months after the wedding, Marcus received an email from an unexpected source, his father. "Son, I need to talk to you about something. Can we meet?" They sat across from each other at a diner neither had suggested, neutral ground discovered by awkward compromise. Richard Coleman looked older than Marcus remembered from the wedding, tired. His legendary cowboy's cap was absent. "I owe you an apology," Richard began, the words clearly difficult. "I've been thinking about what I said at David's rehearsal dinner, about you marching to your own drum. I meant it as... I don't know what I meant it as, but it wasn't fair." Marcus started to speak, but Richard raised his hand. "Let me finish. Last month, David and I were at a game. Cowboys were losing badly in the fourth quarter, and I was worked up. You know how I get. David turned to me and said, 'Dad, you realize you've spent every Sunday for 40 years letting other people's performance control your mood.' And I got defensive, started explaining about loyalty and tradition, and..." He paused, his coffee growing cold. "But then I went home, and I looked at my den. All those jerseys, those signed footballs, those photos of players I've never met. And I realized, what have I built? What have I created? I've invested thousands of hours and thousands of dollars celebrating other men's achievements." This was the conversation Marcus had never expected. "Your brother told me about the nonprofit you started, about the kids you're teaching to code. He showed me the website. 87 kids, Marcus. 87 kids learning skills that will change their lives. You built that while I was yelling at referees on TV." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not saying sports are bad. I'm not saying I'll stop watching. But I think I finally understand what you were choosing all those years. You were choosing to build instead of just watch, and I made you feel bad about that." The apology hung in the air between them. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. Not healing exactly, but recognition. His father had crossed an enormous psychological distance to reach this understanding. "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, because I've been thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the times I could have asked you about your projects, your music, your writing. I chose not to because I didn't understand it, and I felt rejected by your lack of interest in what I loved. But you never rejected me. You just loved different things." The truth was finally spoken. They talked for 3 hours. Marcus shared his theory about redirected tribal instincts, about mirror neurons and cognitive resource allocation. Richard listened, truly listened, in a way he never had before. And slowly, carefully, they began building a new kind of relationship, not based on shared spectating, but on mutual respect for different ways of engaging with the world. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said as they prepared to leave. "When you finish building one of those guitars, or when one of your students gets their first coding job, do you feel what I feel when the Cowboys win?" "I think I feel something deeper," he answered honestly, "because it's not about them winning, it's about me creating. The satisfaction doesn't depend on uncertain outcomes. It comes from the process itself and from the tangible result that exists because of my effort." Richard nodded slowly. "That's what David was trying to tell me. You've got agency. I've just got hope."
Marcus never planned to become a voice for the sports agnostic, but 3 weeks after that conversation with his father, he wrote an essay titled "The Psychology of Choosing Creation Over Spectating" and posted it on Medium.
He expected maybe a few hundred reads from the usual personal growth crowd. It got 847,000 views in the first week. The comments section exploded with stories eerily similar to his own. Thousands of people who had felt isolated, judged, or broken because they couldn't muster enthusiasm for watching strangers play games. People who had been told they were missing out on one of life's great joys, who had been excluded from social circles, who had been labeled as antisocial or odd. "I'm a surgeon," one comment read. "I spend my days performing intricate procedures that save lives. I create outcomes that matter. And yet, at parties, I'm treated like a social failure because I can't discuss last night's game. Your essay explained something I felt but never understood about myself." Another, "I'm raising 3 kids mostly alone, working 2 jobs and trying to keep my small pottery business alive. The idea that I should spend my precious free time watching millionaires play sports so I can fit in has always felt absurd to me. Thank you for validating that choice." And another, "I'm a theoretical physicist. I've published 43 papers, won grants, mentored students, but at my 10-year college reunion, I was the weird one because I hadn't followed our school's football team. Your article made me realize I haven't rejected community, I've built a different one." The essay touched a nerve that went beyond sports. It spoke to a deeper conflict in modern society between passive consumption and active creation, between collective experience and individual achievement, between belonging through observation and belonging through contribution. News outlets began reaching out, first local papers, then national media. Within a month, Marcus was invited on a popular podcast with 2 million listeners. The host, ironically a massive sports fan himself, found the conversation fascinating. "So you're not saying sports are bad?" the host asked. "Not at all," Marcus clarified. "I'm saying that people who choose not to engage with sports aren't deficient. They've made a conscious or sometimes unconscious decision about how to allocate their mental and emotional resources. Their mirror neurons work fine. Their capacity for passion and tribal belonging is intact. They've simply directed those capacities toward different ends. Like building guitars and teaching kids to code, or writing novels, or mastering cooking, or developing expertise in classical music, or any of 1,000 other pursuits that involve active participation rather than passive observation. These people aren't watching someone else's story. They're writing their own." Then came the backlash. Sports media personalities accused Marcus of elitism. Twitter erupted with accusations that he was calling sports fans stupid or inferior. Major sports networks ran segments debunking his anti-sports agenda. "This guy thinks he's better than you because he reads books instead of watching football. Let me tell you something about people who look down on sports fans." But Marcus never claimed superiority. He'd simply argued for equivalence, for the recognition that different uses of cognitive and emotional resources weren't hierarchically ranked. Creating wasn't better than spectating. It was different. The controversy peaked when Dr. Elena Rodriguez herself entered the conversation in a long-form article in Psychology Today titled "The Neuroscience of Non-Fandom: Why We Need to Stop Pathologizing Different Interests." She dismantled the superiority arguments from both sides. Yes, dedicated sports fans showed certain neural benefits: community cohesion, emotional outlets, shared cultural experiences. But individuals focused on creation showed equal benefits in different domains: delayed gratification tolerance, intrinsic motivation, personal agency. Neither pathway is inherently superior. They represent different evolutionary strategies for engaging with the world. Some of us are wired to bond through shared observation of proxy battles. Others are wired to bond through collaborative creation. Both are valid. Both are fully human. The tide began to turn.
2 years after the essay went viral, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference on psychology and culture. The audience of 500 included researchers, educators, and cultural commentators.
He felt prepared. He'd given this talk dozens of times now. What he didn't expect was who would be in the audience. Tom from accounting, his old colleague who'd made those Monday mornings so uncomfortable. Tom who had given him those looks, those subtle judgments, those unspoken messages that Marcus didn't quite belong. After the talk, Tom approached him in the lobby. "I need to tell you something," Tom said, his voice tight with emotion. "I came here to prove you wrong. I came here as a challenge, thinking I'd sit through your speech and then pick apart every argument, because I took your essay personally. I thought you were attacking something I loved." Marcus braced himself for confrontation. "But then you said something that broke me open. You said, 'The measure of a life well lived isn't found in what you watch, but in what you create, contribute, and genuinely connect with.' And I realized I can't name a single thing I've created in the last 20 years. Tom's eyes were red-rimmed. "I'm 53 years old, Marcus. I've spent approximately 15,000 hours of my life watching sports. 15,000 hours. Do you know what I could have done with that time? I always said I wanted to write a book. I always said I wanted to learn piano. I always said I wanted to build things with my son instead of just sitting next to him while we both stared at screens." The confession hung between them. "I'm not saying I was wrong to be a sports fan," Tom continued, "but I was wrong about you. I thought you were the one missing out. I thought you were the one who didn't understand what life was about. But you were building things. You were creating. You were making choices about how to spend the finite resource of your attention." Marcus felt the full weight of this moment, because Tom wasn't the villain of this story. He was another victim of the same misunderstanding. The culture had told them both that sports were necessary for social belonging, that without this shared ritual, connection wasn't possible. "Tom," Marcus said gently, "it's not too late. 53 isn't—" "I know. That's why I'm here. I signed up for piano lessons last month. I'm 2 chapters into the book I always wanted to write. And you know what? It's terrifying, because when you watch sports, you never fail. Your team might fail, but you personally don't. When you create something, you can actually fail. You can be bad at it. You can discover you don't have the talent you imagined." "But you also might discover you do," Marcus offered. Tom nodded. "I had to come tell you this, because 2 years ago, I thought you were the weird one, the broken one, the one who couldn't connect. But you were right all along. Not because sports are bad, they're not, but because there are other ways to be human, other ways to find meaning, and I'd spent so long defending my choice that I couldn't see the cost of it." This was the twist Marcus never saw coming. His essay wasn't just validating people who felt like outsiders. It was waking up people who had never questioned whether they were truly choosing their relationship with sports or simply following a cultural script so deeply embedded they'd mistaken it for their own desires. 3 months later, Tom sent Marcus an email with an attachment, the first 3 chapters of his book. A memoir about fatherhood, failure, and finding yourself at midlife. It was raw, honest, and genuinely moving. "I don't know if this will ever be published," Tom wrote, "but for the first time in decades, I'm proud of something I made with my own hands and my own mind, not proud of something I watched someone else make. Thank you for helping me see the difference."
The conversation Marcus had started evolved into something larger than sports fandom. It became a cultural reckoning with how we spend our attention, our time, our one precious life. Schools began introducing programs called creator tracks, elective classes where students learned that their value wasn't in consuming content, but in producing it. Making music, writing stories, building robots, designing games, growing food, solving real problems. Corporate cultures started recognizing creation bonding alongside traditional sports team building. Companies like Marcus's former employer began offering workshops in woodworking, creative writing,
cooking, coding, ways for employees to connect through making rather than just watching. The sports industry itself responded with surprising nuance. Rather than feeling threatened, many leagues and teams began highlighting the creative aspects of athletics, the strategy, the training discipline, the performance art of movement. They stopped pretending sports were the only valid form of tribal belonging and started positioning themselves as one option among many. But the most profound changes happened quietly, in individual lives. A surgeon in Boston started painting watercolors after 40-hour shifts. A factory worker in Detroit began writing poetry. A lawyer in Los Angeles learned to blacksmith. A teacher in rural Ohio started a community garden that became a gathering place for neighbors who'd never quite fit into the Friday night football culture. These weren't people abandoning community, they were finding it through different channels. Through WhatsApp groups dedicated to sourdough bread techniques, through Discord servers for indie game developers, through weekly meetups of amateur astronomers, local historians, vintage motorcycle restorers. The tribal instinct hadn't disappeared, it had diversified. Marcus's father became an unlikely convert. Richard Coleman didn't stop watching the Cowboys, but he cut his viewing from every game to just the ones that felt genuinely important. And with the reclaimed hours, he started woodworking, something he'd loved as a young man but abandoned when adult responsibilities and sports obsessions took over. At Marcus's house 6 months after their reconciliation, Richard unveiled his first completed project, a hand-carved jewelry box for his wife, Marcus's mother. "I forgot what it felt like," Richard said, running his hands over the smooth cherry wood, "to make something that will outlast me, to use my hands and my mind together, to struggle with a problem and solve it myself rather than hoping a quarterback makes the right throw." He looked at his son with something that might have been pride, or might have been gratitude, or might have been both. "You gave me this, Marcus, not by being right about sports being bad, they're not bad, but by living an example of what else is possible. By showing me that the tribal instinct I thought could only be satisfied by rooting for a team could actually be satisfied by creating something real." The data started emerging. Dr. Rodriguez's research team, now expanded to 12 researchers across 6 universities, published a comprehensive study on post-spectator identity formation. The findings were remarkable. Individuals who reduced passive spectating and increased active creation showed measurable improvements in life satisfaction, 23% increase, sense of personal agency, 31% increase, meaningful social connections, 18% increase, notably with deeper relationship quality, resilience in the face of setbacks, 27% increase, long-term goal achievement, 34% increase. What we're seeing, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her follow-up TED Talk, isn't that one way of being human is superior, it's that modern culture had overvalued one form of tribal engagement at the expense of others. When we give people permission to direct their tribal instincts toward creation rather than observation, they often discover capacities they didn't know they had.
Conclusion: The Man Who Chose to Build. 5 years after writing his essay, Marcus stood in the same conference room where he'd once felt invisible during Monday morning sports talk. But everything was different now. The company had been transformed. Yes, some people still bonded over sports, and that was fine. But the culture had expanded to make room for other forms of connection. The bulletin board that once only featured fantasy football standings now included photos of employee art projects, book recommendations, coding tutorials, and volunteer opportunities. Marcus had been promoted, not despite his differences, but partly because of them. His willingness to forge his own path, to allocate his resources deliberately rather than by default, had translated into innovation in his work. He saw problems differently because he thought differently. But the real victory wasn't professional. It was in the letter he'd received the previous week from a 16-year-old in Oklahoma named Jamie. Jamie had been bullied throughout high school for not caring about football in a town where Friday night games were religion. She'd felt broken, isolated, wrong. Then she'd read Marcus's essay. "You helped me understand that I'm not missing something in my brain," Jamie wrote. "I'm just building different things with it. While they're memorizing quarterback statistics, I'm studying astrophysics. While they're arguing about draft picks, I'm learning Mandarin. While they're watching replays, I'm tutoring kids in math. I'm not broken. I'm just playing a different game, one where I'm a participant, not a spectator. Thank you for helping me see that." This was the revolution Marcus had accidentally started. Not a revolution against sports, not a revolution claiming moral superiority for creators over observers, but a revolution of recognition that human beings can satisfy their deepest tribal instincts in multiple ways. That the mirror neurons firing when someone watches their team score can also fire when they complete their own challenging project. That community can form around shared creation as easily as around shared spectating. The social cost of being different hadn't disappeared entirely. There were still spaces where not knowing about sports meant exclusion. Still family gatherings where the conversation split between those discussing games and those awkwardly silent. But now there was recognition, understanding, permission. Permission for people to say, "I direct my passion elsewhere," without judgment. Permission for individuals to choose building over watching without being labeled antisocial. Permission for human beings to express their tribal nature through the infinite varieties of creation rather than the single channel of sports observation. Marcus looked out his office window at the city below. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and lives, thousands of people were making the same choice he'd made years ago, choosing to write instead of watch, to build instead of spectate, to create their own narratives instead of consuming someone else's story. They weren't better than sports fans, they weren't worse, they were simply different. And in a world that had finally learned to see that difference as valid rather than deficient, they were no longer invisible. The lonely outsider had become a pioneer. Not by changing who he was, but by refusing to pretend to be someone else. And in that refusal, he'd given permission to millions of others to do the same. The tribal instinct hadn't been rejected, it had been redirected. And in that redirection, a new form of human connection had emerged, one built not on arbitrary affiliation, but on authentic contribution. This was the mindset of people who don't obsess over sports. Not antisocial, not broken, not deficient, simply different, deliberately so, and finally understood. So here's my question for you. What are you building? What's your own narrative that you're creating instead of consuming someone else's story? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear what you're passionate about, what you're creating, what drives you beyond the screen. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like an outsider for not obsessing over sports, hit that subscribe button, because this channel is for the builders, the creators, the people writing their own stories.